Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. It's also important to know that ideas have histories. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. If you've caught Breakpoint over the last month or so, you've heard me say more than once that I think The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis could be his most important book. At least, it's his most important book for our particular cultural moment. It's one of those remarkably prophetic works, more applicable to the cultural moment in which we live than it was in even the cultural moment in which Lewis was writing. In The Abolition of Man and its various essays, Lewis was uncovering the ways that the modern world was logically inconsistent, how things that were being planted weren't going to bring the fruit that many moderns hoped that it would. That's why I think it's so important to understand the observations that he was making back then, and why we are so excited this month to offer not only a copy of The Abolition of Man, but a copy of the brand new book, After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, written by one of the world's top C.S. Lewis scholars, Dr. Michael Ward. Dr. Ward is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall in the University of Oxford and a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University in Texas. He's authored several books on C.S. Lewis, but this is his first essay-by-essay guide to The Abolition of Man. And for a gift of any amount to the Colson Center this month, we'll send you a copy both of The Abolition of Man and Ward's guide, After Humanity. Earlier this week, Dr. Ward spoke with my colleague Shane Morris about some of the ways that modern culture was so inconsistent, the sort of things that it was planting in the cultural soil and the sort of things that it would actually harvest. Here's Dr. Ward.
However much we may wish to be surgeons, chopping up nature to suit our own desires, we must stop at some point. That is to say, we must stop before we chop ourselves up. And that's why, you reach this position of logical incoherence. He talks about the famous case of the Irishman who discovered that a certain kind of stove would heat his house with only half the amount of fuel. And he concluded that if he got two stoves of the same kind, he could heat his house with no fuel at all. So, but it's that kind of logical incoherence that you think because we have such a linear imagination, we think that if we keep taking the same series of steps ever onwards into the broad sunlit uplands of the future, that we can go on indefinitely. But there is one step which is incommensurable with all the previous steps, and that is when we begin to treat ourselves as raw material, mere nature, to be chopped up to suit our own convenience. Science is a good thing, but science pushed to dehumanizing extremes is obviously not a good thing. And likewise, seeing through things, penetrating the veil of falsity, seeing through propaganda, understanding false peace, false consciousness, all that kind of penetration is good. But you see through things in order to see something through them. You see through the window in order to see the garden. But if the garden was transparent like the window, what would I see through the garden? The world would become invisible. But a world in which everything is invisible is a world in which effectively we are all blind. That's why he finishes with that famously negative statement, to see through all things is the same as not to see. In other words, humility is really the answer. We mustn't think that we can master ourselves in the same way that we might choose, and might rightly choose, to master almost everything else.
To get a copy of Dr. Ward's guide to The Abolition of Man, as well as a copy of C.S. Lewis's classic book, The Abolition of Man, come to breakpoint.org/October. That's breakpoint.org/October. We'll send you a copy of both books for a gift of any kind. And that's not all. Dr. Ward was gracious enough to also provide video introductions to various parts of his guide, as well as host a live webinar. All of this is accessible this month to anyone who gives a gift to the Colson Center. Go to breakpoint.org/October. Again, that's breakpoint.org/October. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.